Hello YouTube. I assume you have some intuitive grasp of what a species is, but once we try to understand this concept more precisely, we end up with all sorts of philosophical knots, which we will try to untangle today. There are many questions we might ask about the concept of species, but what I want to focus on is, what is it that distinguishes one species from another? What property or set of properties does a population of organisms need to have in order for that population to count as a species? This is known as the species problem. First, let's consider the place of species in biological taxonomy as a whole. Species is the smallest unit in the standard Linnaean hierarchy of biological taxonomy, which I assume you're familiar with. A population of organisms forms a species, a population of species forms a genus, and so on through family, order, class, phylum, kingdom, domain. Those are the main taxa. Sometimes you see others. But I think it's fair to say that most biologists would accept that there's something pretty arbitrary about the higher taxa, whether various species count as the same genus, whether various orders count as the same class. That's to a large extent arbitrary. The natural world is not itself divided into genus, family, order, class, and so on. So, in other words, suppose you have a particular phylogenetic tree. Is this top clade a family or is it an order? It doesn't really matter. It's practically useful for us to organise things according to the Linnaean system, but it doesn't match reality. And actually, there are some biologists who think that it's not even practically useful and that we should just do away with the Linnaean hierarchy and use something else, but that's a separate topic. But anyway, species are different. Most biologists would probably say that there really are species, and it's pretty difficult to see how we could understand the living world if the distinction between species is just arbitrary. I mean, we assume, for instance, that there are facts about biodiversity. So one of the main measures of biodiversity is species richness, which is just the number of different species in a particular ecosystem. But if distinguishing species is arbitrary in the same way that distinguishing different orders or different families is, well, obviously there are no facts here. Similarly, how should we go about constructing past evolutionary relationships? How can we even get started building a tree of life if you don't have a clear idea of what distinguishes one species from another? So the way I like to put this is with Plato's idea of carving nature at its joints. There are real differences between some things in the natural world. Our classification of chemical elements carves nature at its joints. Chemical elements aren't just arbitrary. There are real and important differences between each element in terms of the number of protons that each one has. Similarly, we hope that species should reflect real distinctions in the world. If I say the hooded crow and the common raven are different types of the same species, but my friend says that they're simply different species, there's a fact of the matter which one is right. But obviously, all of this hinges on how we define species. So let's consider some different ways of thinking about what a species is. Probably the oldest species concept is the morphological or phonetic species concept. On the morphological species concept, organisms are grouped into different species on the basis of their morphology. And the morphology of an organism is its form or structure, where this includes both the outward appearance, so what colour it is, does it have limbs, does it have hair or fur or scales, and it includes its internal structure, the placement of its organs, its skeleton, and so on. So on this view, a species is simply a group of morphologically similar organisms. That's just how you distinguish one species from another. You look to see if they look the same. This species concept was once widely accepted. It was influenced by early essentialist approaches to biology. Before Darwin, it was held that species are essentially fixed and unchanging. God has built the world and put species in it, and although there can be some variation within species, there are limits to how much a species can change. Every species has certain essential properties that can't change. Just as a historical point, this wasn't actually such a crazy view. Humans had long engaged in artificial selection, so we would breed animals or plants to have certain traits. We want chickens that lay the biggest eggs, dogs that are aggressive for protecting the house, turnips that grow as big as possible. So let's say you want to artificially select for bigger dogs. Well, you have a bunch of dogs and you breed only the biggest ones. Then in the next generation you breed only the biggest ones, and so on. Your dogs will get big very rapidly. It won't take long for the average size of the population to increase. But after a while you'll hit a point where the dogs just don't seem to get any bigger. You probably won't be able to breed dogs bigger than horses, for instance. So this lent a lot of support to the view that species can only change within set limits. There's some variation that can be allowed, but species essentially have these kind of essential properties that are fixed and unchanging. I mean, obviously nowadays we know that this fact about artificial selection is because each species has a certain amount of natural genetic variation that arises through mutation. Eventually artificial breeding runs out of mutation to work with, as it were. If you want to breed dogs bigger than horses, you have to wait for mutation at the loci determining size. But anyway, that's kind of beside the point. Unsurprisingly, most biologists reject the morphological species concept, although there are a few who've defended it. So there are several problems with this kind of approach. First of all, polymorphism. Polymorphism refers to significant morphological differences between members of the same species. When members of the same species have very different phenotypes, that's a polymorphic species. And this happens quite often. It's obvious in species that exhibit significant sexual dimorphism, morphological differences between males and females. Here's a male and female peacock and a male and female of a single species of spider. Similarly, there are often significant differences between juvenile and mature forms of animals. Consider Lepidoptera, moths and butterflies. They begin life as caterpillars, which look completely different to their adult form. We wouldn't want to say that two animals are different species just because they're different sexes or different ages. Second, kind of the opposite problem, there are many different species that look the same. These include what are called cryptic species, species that are different but that end up being given the same name because they look so similar, people didn't realise they were different. Here's a great example from Wikipedia. The salamander on the left, the Corsican fire salamander, was once thought to be the same species as the fire salamander on the right. But they're actually very different species, and the Corsican fire salamander is more closely related to this alpine salamander, which looks very different. Another example is mimicry. Some species of butterflies taste very unpleasant to predators, and so predators avoid those species of butterflies. And what happens is that completely unrelated species of butterflies, which may taste delicious to predators, will adapt to look like the unpleasant ones, so the predators will avoid them as well. Okay, beyond these points, there's kind of a deep philosophical problem with the morphological species concept, deriving from its appeal to similarity. Similarity is a very slippery notion. We say that two objects are similar insofar as they share certain properties. If I say that X is similar to Y, it's always legitimate to ask, well, in what respect are they similar? And then I would cite properties that they both share. Rats are similar to armadillos in that they're both quadrupedal, they both have two eyes, they're both vertebrates. The trouble is that depending on what properties you focus on, anything can be similar or not similar to anything else. Consider myself and the cup on the table next to me. Well, we're similar in that we're in the same room, we're close in space and time, we both contain water, neither of us is a bear, neither of us is green, neither of us is made of battery acid, and so on. The basic issue here was pointed out by Nelson Goodman, which is that any object has basically an infinite number of properties. So for any two objects, there will be an infinite number of ways they're the same or different. Take a list of all the properties two objects might have. It will look a bit like this, going on forever. Now add ticks and crosses for the properties the objects have and don't have. So, these are two objects, and this is just an infinite list of all the properties there are. And then we're adding ticks, and then we're adding crosses for the properties that each object has and doesn't have. Well, obviously, they're going to share an infinite number of ticks and crosses, and they're going to differ in an infinite number of ticks and crosses, and that will be the case no matter what two objects you choose. Now, we might object to this argument that it kind of requires very unnatural, gerrymandered properties. Does my cup really have the property of not being a bear? Can there be negative properties like that? Similarly, relational properties such as an object's place in space and time, should that really count? Maybe we should only focus on the intrinsic properties of the object. Nevertheless, though, I think this argument is clearly hinting at something important. Similarity is highly subjective. Maybe Goodman's conclusion is a bit too extreme, but I think we can agree with the general point that similarity, ideally it's not something we really want to appeal to in scientific classification. Okay, so next there is the biological species concept, which is maybe a kind of an unfair name for it, because actually every species concept is going to be biological. I'm not sure I know of a species concept that doesn't have anything to do with biology, but it's called the biological species concept, and this is probably the most famous, although I'm not sure how many people actually accept it. Whenever biologists or philosophers of biology address the species problem, they always cite this concept in order to show how it doesn't work. So it gets talked about a lot, but whether it's widely accepted, I'm not sure. Anyway, it was articulated most famously by Ernst Mayr. And according to Mayr, what we have to bear in mind is that species are not fixed things, they're constantly changing populations of individuals. So there's no point trying to define species in terms of their own sort of properties, in terms of similarity or anything like that. We have to look at how each population of individuals relates to other populations. So Mayr says that species are groups of actually or potentially interbreeding natural populations which are reproductively isolated from other groups. So a species is a population of organisms that breed with each other, but that don't breed with other populations. That's what reproductive isolation is. It means that each species reproduces only with members of the species. If you want to figure out whether the common raven and the hooded crow are different species, you just have to look at whether or not they interbreed. This definition emphasises the importance of restricting gene flow. So whereas the morphological species criterion defines species in terms of morphological differences, the biological concept helps explain how those differences arise. Because if A and B are different species, on the biological concept, there will be no gene flow between A and B. New mutation and variation that arises in the one won't be passed to the other, and that allows significant change. If the populations interbreed, they'll be homogenized. So I think this is a very nice definition, very simple, easy to apply, and there's obviously something important about reproductive isolation, but there are problems. The first question here is how exactly we should understand the notion of reproductive isolation. There are various kinds of isolating mechanisms. There are pre-zygotic barriers which act to prevent fertilization, and post-zygotic barriers which prevent the offspring from developing properly. Here's a chart. So one kind of pre-zygotic barrier is if the populations are separated in space and time. A population of frogs in Europe won't be able to interbreed with a population in America, or with a population living 100 years before them. But as Mayer's definition put it, species can be potentially interbreeding populations. So it may be that if we brought the European frogs and American frogs together, they would interbreed. Gametic isolation is a good example of Mayer's idea of reproductive isolation. This is where the gametes, even if they come together, can't fuse into a zygote. Perhaps, the sperm and egg are chemically incompatible. For post-zygotic barriers, well, hybrid zygotes might die before they mature, or hybrids might be able to be mature but be infertile. Mules and hinnies, which are produced by crossing donkeys and horses are completely infertile, so that prevents any kind of gene flow between donkeys and horses. So some cases are clear-cut, but others are more difficult. Mechanical isolation occurs when the reproductive organs aren't compatible. The penis is too big for the vagina or the wrong shape or something. Some insects require very specific shapes of reproductive organs in order for sex to occur. The problem here is that arguably, with some species that are mechanically isolated, we might be able to use artificial insemination to produce offspring. So, does mechanical isolation count or doesn't it? Chihuahuas and golden retrievers are often considered varieties of the same species, but they wouldn't be able to interbreed without artificial aid. Even more difficult is behavioural isolation. This occurs when one population just don't recognise another population as potential mates. In many species of frog, males have very specific calls, and females will only mate with males who have the right call. Are these frogs reproductively isolated? For two populations of frogs A and B, it could be that A and B simply don't recognise each other as mates, but if they did, they'd be able to produce viable offspring. So there's maybe a few problems defining exactly what counts as reproductive isolation. I don't think this is necessarily a serious problem for the biological species concept, because this is really just a case of vagueness. This man is bald, this man isn't bald, but there are going to be some intermediate cases where it's not obvious whether or not we should call him bald. These sand grains are a heap, these aren't a heap, and then there are some difficult cases. Vagueness is a classic philosophical problem, and it arises everywhere in daily life. So I think it's kind of unfair to criticise a species concept for being vague. I mean, indeed, species is one area where vagueness really shouldn't be troubling. Given the nature of evolution, gradual change over long periods of time, we shouldn't expect that there will always be strict lines between species. I think I'd be happy to say that cases like the frogs and the chihuahuas and golden retrievers, they're just indeterminate. They're in the middle of speciating, and it doesn't really matter whether we class them as one species or two. A similar problem, but I think more serious, is presented by species changing over geographic area and species changing over time. Let's say that you have three relatively well-defined populations of animals, A, B and C, and they inhabit different areas. So, but there's a bit of overlap. So different areas but some overlap. Now, it may be the case that A can interbreed with B, and B can interbreed with C, but C can't interbreed with A, because C are just sort of too different. They're, C and B are similar enough that they can interbreed, A and B is similar enough that they can interbreed, but A and C are too different to interbreed. A famous example of this is salamanders in the US. They sort of occupy different populations, occupy different ranges, and if you go to like the very south of the US, the salamanders there won't be able to interbreed with the ones much further north. So you can see the problem here. Since A can interbreed with B, the biological species concept counts them as the same species. B can interbreed with C, so they're the same species. By the transitivity of identity, A and C are the same species. But A and C can't interbreed, so they're not the same species. We've got a straightforward contradiction. So in other words, from the point of view of A, there are two species here. There's A and B as one species, and C as the second species. From the point of view of B, there's just one species, A and B and C, because B can interbreed with both A and C. So from the point of view of B, there's just one species here. And then from the point of view of C, again, there's two species, but this time comprising A on the one hand and B and C on the other. And of course, we get the same problem if we consider species changing over time. So we can imagine in this case that C are the present members of the lineage, B is the lineage 10 million years ago, A is the lineage 20 million years ago. Okay, well, an obvious response here is just, again, this is, isn't this just an example of vagueness? I think that the problem in this case isn't solved quite so easily, though. I think that what this problem gets at is I don't know, a different kind of vagueness, a kind of vicious vagueness that's worse than standard vagueness. So consider again baldness. This man is bald, this man is not bald, and this man is somewhere in between. He's got a bit of hair, he's got hair on the side. It's not necessarily obvious where he goes. So in this case we have two categories, bald or not bald, and the problem with vagueness is which category do we put the intermediate cases in? The same is true with heaps of sand. We have a heap and not a heap, and then a few difficult intermediate cases. If you reflect on other examples of vagueness, I think you'll see that they usually have this structure. When does a child become an adult? When does liking someone become loving someone? When does the colour red become not red? Or to use an example from earlier, when does reproductively intermixed become reproductively isolated? Is behavioural isolation sufficient, or is more required? So that's standard vagueness. Now I think that what this problem is pointing at, though, is vagueness of a different kind. If this were an example of standard vagueness, we would have two categories, two well-defined species, and we'd have some difficult intermediate cases where we're not really sure if it's species A or species B. Do these organisms belong in the first species or the second? But that's not the problem here. Remember, the difficulty arises because depending on what baseline we choose, we get different counts of how many species there are. From the point of view of A, there are two species, since A can interbreed with B but not C. From the point of view of B, there's only one species, since B can interbreed with A and C. So the problem isn't simply that we're not sure what category to put intermediate cases in. The problem is that we can't even define the categories in the first place. So this vagueness about species that's introduced by the biological species criterion isn't simply everyday vagueness. And I think this is maybe a bit more of a serious problem. So that would need a bit more. We need to think about that a bit more carefully to solve that one. Okay, third. Well, arguably some different species can interbreed. This is especially true for plants, which can easily hybridize, and the hybrids are often fertile. A good example is grapefruit. Grapefruit is the hybrid between the Asian pomelo and the Jamaican orange. Within the animal kingdom, wolves and coyotes can hybridize to produce coy wolves, which are just as fertile as their parents. And yet wolves and coyotes maintain significantly different behaviours and morphologies. It would be a bit strained, I think, to call them the same species. Perhaps the most serious limitation of the biological species criterion is that most living things reproduce asexually. The vast, vast majority of living things are prokaryotes, bacteria and archaea. Prokaryotes are asexual. One bacterium will split into two bacteria through binary fission, no sex involved. So whatever the merits of the biological species criterion, it looks like we simply can't apply it to most of life. I mean, prokaryotes are the vast majority of life by any measure. Just if you look at it in terms of the numbers, even if you look at it in terms of biomass, the mass of all the bacteria and archaea is far greater than the mass of the animals and plants and fungi. If you look at the whole world, that's how many there are. There's loads of them. So the biological species criterion really seems to fall down when it comes to most living things. Now, I mean, we might sort of say, well, are there ways to save this? And one idea might be that we can appeal to what's known as conjugation. So prokaryotes can actually engage in something a bit like reproduction, conjugation, and this is a form of lateral gene transfer. Everybody's familiar with vertical gene transfer. Vertical transfer is when genetic material is passed from parents to offspring, from one generation to the next generation. Lateral gene transfer is when genes can be passed between members of the same generation, and it's a very important aspect of prokaryote evolution. One way that lateral gene transfer occurs is conjugation. So let's say we have two bacterial cells. These are the cells. Here's the main bacterial chromosome here, this black circle. And And then we have these little things called plasmids. Plasmids are basically very small chromosomes, but they contain useful genetic material. Now, along with the flagella, which are used for movement, bacteria are covered in hair-like structures called pili, or pili, and some have a specialised sex pilus. They use the sex pilus to connect up to other bacteria, like so, and then they copy plasmids from one to the other. So imagine if you saw somebody with a nice jawline and you were able to copy his DNA and have the jawline for yourself. This is one of the reasons why antimicrobial resistance is such a problem. If one bacterium has genetic material that confers resistance, it can pass it on directly to a whole load of other bacteria. It can sort of bypass the usual evolutionary processes of reproduction. So we might say that this is a kind of genetic exchange, and we can expand the biological species concept to include this kind of conjugation, right? So, two populations of bacteria will count as the same species just in case they can conjugate. The problem with this is that conjugation appears to occur between totally different kinds of bacteria. Again, this is a big part of antimicrobial resistance. Bacteria that are harmless and native to your body develop resistance to methicillin. They pass their methicillin resistance genes onto the Staphylococcus aureus that's infecting you, and then you have MRSA. So this is really a big problem, I think, for the biological species criterion. Now, many biologists, including Ernst Mayr, have just bitten the bullet. Mayr says that asexuals don't have species. Asexuals can only be pseudo-species, not real species. I think this comes across as pretty desperate, but maybe it's not such a crazy idea. I mean, bear in mind that the concept of species was introduced to deal with more complex forms of life. Talk about species developed largely with respect to organisms that reproduce sexually. So maybe we shouldn't be surprised if we can't extend this concept to asexual organisms. I don't think in principle it would have been crazy for things to develop in such a way that we only use the term species to refer to sexually reproducing organisms. But I guess the basic problem here is just that this concept, the concept of species has already been extended to asexual organisms. Microbiologists will often distinguish different species of bacteria and archaea. If you tell them there's no such thing as bacterial species, they'll probably just laugh at you. So, that ship has sailed, right? There just are different species of prokaryotes. So, whatever the merits of the biological species criterion, we need to consider other options. The ecological species concept was developed by Leigh van Valen, and he says a species is a lineage or a closely related set of lineages which occupies an adaptive zone minimally different from that of any other lineage in its range, and which evolves separately from all lineages outside its range. Okay, so adaptive zone. There are going to be different kinds of resources available. There will be certain threats from the environment and from other species. Basically, there will be various different ways of making a living in any particular environment. And if you look at any one species, there will be specific things they prey on. Okay, so specific resources that they use. There will be specific things that prey on them. There will be a certain part of the environment that they utilize for shelter or mating or whatever. In other words, each species occupies a specific ecological niche. Now, for Van Valen, reproductive isolation doesn't really matter, provided the two populations are sufficiently similar from the point of view of ecology. Two populations might not be able to reproduce with each other, but as long as they have the same adaptive zone, they count as the same species. And similarly, just because two populations do reproduce with each other, that doesn't mean they're different species. The example of wolves and coyotes will be a good one there. This definition certainly has its benefits. So, first of all, it focuses on the actual evolutionary forces that lead species to diverge and that maintain species cohesion. It focuses on how species are differentiated by different ecological forces, the different selective challenges of particular parts of the environment. Second, it applies perfectly well to prokaryotes, has no trouble at all with cases like plant hybridization. So it also gels well with some empirical results of ecology, such as the competitive exclusion principle. This says that if you have two populations competing for the same resource, one of them will overcome the other. Either one population will become extinct or its behaviour will change. You don't get two species occupying exactly the same adaptive zone. This leads to an interesting phenomenon known as character displacement. Suppose you have two very similar species and their distributions overlap. Well, in the regions where they overlap, the differences between them will be significantly accentuated. The classic example of this is Darwin's finches, the Galapagos finches. So suppose one species occurs on island A and B, and the other occurs on islands B and C. Well, the two species that coexist on island B will have noticeably different beaks. However, if you compare the species on island A with the species on island C, their beaks will be pretty much indistinguishable. Different beaks are used for different resources, so we can see that where the two species overlap, competitive exclusion has pushed them to have slightly different adaptive zones. So the differences between the species are reflected in their different adaptive zones that they occupy where they overlap. So this is quite a useful concept. Again, it has its problems. First of all, there's a problem with the very idea of an adaptive zone. Adaptive zones are defined independently of the species that occupy them. Van Valen explicitly says that an adaptive zone is part of the environment, as distinct from the way of life of a taxon that may occupy it, and exists independently of any inhabitants it may have. That's a direct quote. But this is very unrealistic. Every organism will change its environment, sometimes substantially. For instance, we know how beavers can build their own ponds, and there are many cases where organisms have radically changed the environment unintentionally. When deer are introduced to places where they have no natural predators, their populations will explode and they will devastate the local resources. The environment isn't something fixed that can be defined independently of the species that occupy it. Now actually, I'm not sure how much of a problem this is for the ecological species concept. Perhaps it could be altered to allow that species can affect its adaptive zone. So we can say, okay, we can't specify an adaptive zone independently of the species that occupy it, but we can still say that the fact that these two organisms occupy different adaptive zones shows that they're different species. On the other hand, though, this does kind of point to a further problem, which is that how do we define adaptive zones in the first place? According to the ecological species concept, species are defined in terms of adaptive zones. So once you show that two organisms have different adaptive zones, you've shown that they're different species. But in practice, I think generally we first assume that we can divide up the species, and then we fix the zones of those species. You look at a particular population of organisms that seem to be the same species, and then you consider how ecological forces affect this population. So in other words, in practice, species are distinguished before adaptive zones are. We don't say Group A and Group B occupy different adaptive zones, so they must be different species. We say, here are two species, what are the different ecological pressures they are subject to? So arguably, the ecological concept gets things backwards. Second, many species occupy different niches, different zones at different times of their life. Consider many polymorphic species, like we saw earlier, moths and butterflies. Surely a caterpillar and a butterfly occupy different adaptive zones. In terms of their behaviour, they're totally different. I suppose one way you could fix this is to specify adaptive zones disjunctively. So we could say that an organism is a member of Acherontia atropos. Acherontia atropos is a species of death's head hawk moth. We could say that an organism is a member of Acherontia atropos just in case it occupies adaptive zone A or adaptive zone B. The obvious problem with this approach is that we could do this with any arbitrary population of animals. So I could say that rats and bats are actually the same species, rat bat, and that something is a rat bat just in case it occupies this adaptive zone or that adaptive zone. Now, that would be really silly, but the only reason why we can say that that's silly is because we have some independent way of telling that rats and bats are very different species. Similarly, we have an independent way of telling that polymorphic species which are polymorphic can be the same species despite being different at different times in their lives. Third, how different do the adaptive zones of two populations need to be for them to count as different species? So the definition says that a species is a lineage that occupies an adaptive zone minimally different from that of any other lineage in its range. So what does minimally different mean? Well, obviously the idea here is that minor differences in adaptive zone matter, small differences. And this makes sense. Species are generally distinguished in terms of small differences. The difference between the common raven and the hooded crow is very small indeed. So you can see the motivation here. If we held that adaptive zones have to be significantly different, we'd end up underestimating the number of species. But the trouble is there's often plenty of ecological diversity within species. Just consider humans. Aboriginal humans surely occupy a different adaptive zone to European humans. Are we going to say that Aborigines are a different species? What about the differences between people living in tribes in Africa and people in central Tokyo? Are they different species? I mean, that's pretty strained. So in general, this criterion has difficulty with ecological generalists, species that can adopt many ecological roles. I mean, we can put this in the form of a dilemma. If we say that adaptive zones have to be significantly different, we underestimate the number of species. But if we say they have to be minimally different, we overestimate the number of species. I guess this is quite a good example of the point I made just a minute ago, that species are distinguished before their adaptive zones are. This is why we can say that some species occupy narrow adaptive zones, some occupy many diverse adaptive zones, because we can distinguish species before we figure out what adaptive zones they occupy. Okay, final problem occurs with cases where competition between populations for the same adaptive zone leads one population to extinction. Jerry Coyne and H. Alan Orr give the example of the Argentine rat Linepothema humile, which was introduced into Bermuda and supplanted the unrelated Phaidole megacephala. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but that's what they're called. So one ant occupied a particular niche, but this other ant came along and took it over. So the trouble is that if we adopt the ecological concept, then it looks like we have to say that these are the same species of ant, because they occupy the same adaptive zone. But surely what's really happened here is that one species drove the other out. So we saw earlier that the ecological criterion seemed to gel well with the competitive exclusion principle. But even this becomes a problem when competitive exclusion leads not to both species changing, but to one species becoming extinct. Because then both species occupy the same adaptive zone, one after the other. And if we define species in terms of the adaptive zone they occupy, then it looks like we just have to say that, yep, that's the same species, which is pretty implausible. Right, well, that's enough today. In the next part of this video, we'll look at some other ways of approaching this problem, but I think that's enough for now. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.